the 11th day, the 11th month, the 11th hour, bells were rung throughout the world. The war to end wars had had its day.
The year was 1973. The war in Vietnam was winding down. The Watergate investigation was in full swing. I had just enrolled at UW River Falls and found myself spending time in South Hall, drawn to the office of Noble Stockton, a quirky and esoteric professor of philosophy and history. I and other students would gather in his small office to drink coffee and exchange radical ideas about changing the world. It's where I first learned the vocabulary of liberalism. It's where I developed critical thinking skills. It's where the seeds of my activism were planted. It's also where I met Thomas R. Smith. Being a small town and campus, our paths crossed throughout my college years. It was after I finally graduated in '81 and moved to Alaska that Thomas and his wife Krista moved into the house I had moved out of, in a beautiful little corner of River Falls, a stone's throw away from the Kinnickinnic River, where they live today. I'm very pleased to have stayed in touch with Thomas, very proud whenever I hear Garrison Keillor read his poems on public radio, very honored to consider him a friend. His work has reached wide national audiences, not only on Garrison Keillor's Writer's Almanac, but also in the syndicated newspaper column American Life and Poetry, written by former U.S. poet Laureate Ted Kooser. Thomas has had hundreds of poems published on 3 continents. He's written 6 books of poetry. The 2 most recent are Walking Before Dawn and The Foot of the Rainbow, both published by Red Dragonfly Press, which I understand is just down the road. He has edited several books, most recently Airmail, The Letters of Robert Bly and Tomas Transtumer. Since 2000, he has taught highly regarded poetry classes at the Loft Literary Center in Minneapolis, most recently as an advisor to the Loft Forward program. He leads poetry workshops at the annual Minnesota Men's Conference, founded by Robert Bly, by whom he was mentored. You can learn more about his awards and accomplishments on his website, thomasrsmithpoet.com. Thomas frequently lends his talents to causes of peace and justice, most recently for democracy in his home state of Wisconsin. Today he'll be reading a few poems from his new chapbook, Dream Union, Poems in Defense of Democracy. Sales from this are going to benefit Mary Burke's campaign to defeat Governor Scott Walker. I believe that's a cause we can all get behind. It was less than a year ago, many of us Veterans for Peace witnessed our comrades being arrested for merely standing in the Madison Capitol Rotunda. This is not the democracy I learned about in high school civics class. Thomas has a table in the back where you can buy his work and support this effort. Without further ado, I'm honored to present Thomas R. Smith.
Does anybody have a watch that I could borrow for approximately half an hour? If I can read it. The only wristwatch I've ever owned in my life went through my mother's Ringer washing machine when I was 14. So at that point I decided, well, maybe I better become a poet. Let's see. Well, here I am at this mic. I don't know, should I be at that one? I'm not sure. This seems fine to me. Okay, it's 3:16. I'm going to, oh, shit. Sorry, I've been having trouble with this pair of glasses, and I just realized one of the lenses vacated. Okay, well, I'm just going to fake it. I'm just going to fake it. No. Wow, I just don't want to step on it here. I don't see it. Okay, well, that's weird. That's never happened to me before. So, let's, leaving trivialities aside, like where your left lens is gone. Wow, that seems strange too. I'm going to start out with a poem by another great old poet that many of us admire, William Stafford. Stafford was an indefatigable champion of peace and justice and reconciliation. And something I heard about that seemed really right to me was a group of people around the Stafford Foundation over in Oregon this year had a festival last weekend in honor of Stafford, and the theme of it was Take Back the Fourth, Speak Truth to Power. Well, that's what you've been doing here, for a dozen years or so. But I think this is a good thing for America to adopt. Take back the fourth, speak truth to power. So this is a poem of Stafford's called For the Unknown Enemy. This monument is for the unknown good in our enemies. Like a picture, their life began to appear. They gathered at home in the evening and sang. Above their fields they saw a new sky. A holiday came, and they carried the baby to the park for a party. Sunlight surrounded them. Here we glimpse what our minds long turned away from. The great mutual blindness darkened that sunlight in the park, and the sky that was new, and the holidays. This monument says that one afternoon we stood here letting a part of our minds escape. They came back, but different. Enemy, one day we glimpsed your life. This monument is for you. So, William Stafford. Okay. So, I'm going to start out with a poem of the season. This is the time of year that we start thinking about this subject. It's called Ode to Shade. In my backyard, two black walnut trees converge to roll down their long bolt of shade. The fabric, delicate, lacy, lets pinwheeling mandalas of daylight in between the spirals of leafleted stems. They wave a filigreed plume in summer wind, contributing coolness, throwing leafy sprays over the hammock's delighted occupant. Green, layered, uprush, mountaining, cumulonimbus, towering storm bringing rain of shade to the sweltering earth. At the bottom of its cool well, we sit on lawn chairs, modest, low to the ground, as figures in Chinese landscape painting, humanity properly scaled to the great, slow cataclysms of nature. Is there anything we do as perfectly as the trees leafing? What do we make from the light we're given? We blaze readily into conflagrations, terrible fires that can never be taken back. Better to seek refuge from the winds that stoke rage, sheltered under a great tree, accumulator of peace, holding out to all in this torched world the hope of a place at a calm table like this one, together in the freely offered, freely taken shade. Thanks. As mentioned, I'm here on a somewhat uncovert mission I've just published this little booklet of poems called Dream Union. And the reason I do it is because being a typical indigent poet, I don't have nearly as much money to contribute to political causes as I might wish. So I can print up a few hundred copies of one of these and contribute like $1,000 to booting Scott Walker in Wisconsin. So that's what I'm doing with it. So I have got a bunch of these with me, and if you buy one from me, every cent of it goes to the Mary Burke campaign. So, and thanks, Mary, for getting everyone on my side immediately by announcing that at the beginning. This is my poor imitation of the Middle Eastern ghazal form. If you're not familiar with this form, it uses a certain kind of repetition at the ends of the stanzas, much in the way that standard English poetry uses rhyme at the end of lines. It's a mnemonic device. It's a repetitive device. In this case, each one of these stanzas ends with the word or the name Goliath. These days, we all feel diminished. Goliath's genius is to convince the little person he's with him on his side, fighting Goliath. Wisconsin was first to pass workers' comp in 1911. As school children, we felt proud that our state had subdued Goliath. Our scoutmaster preached responsibility, but when he went back to his tent to drink, we could sense the restless presence of Goliath. Goliath is so much bigger than one corrupt politician. We've all grown too comfortable with losing to Goliath. We can't afford to wait for the second coming of fighting Bob La Follette. Let's all find our stone of purpose to sling at Goliath. Please don't take me literally. Goliath is a force that keeps coming back to life. Each new generation must find its way to bring down Goliath. This mine? Must be. Nobody else has gotten it. Okay. Well, I can't be giving a reading in a beautiful place dedicated to music as this barn is without reading a tribute to a musician. And I wrote this a couple of summers ago for the 100th anniversary of the birth of Woody Guthrie, which was July 14th, 1912, his birth date. We're almost there again. Happy birthday, Woody. Happy 102nd. This is the title poem. It's called Dream Union. By the way, this was published first in Minneapolis in Harvey Winge's The Alley newspaper, a wonderful community newspaper. Maybe some of you see it up in the city. Dream Union. Woodrow Wilson Guthrie, you not only faced the headlines, but made music of them. And perhaps that too was the biggest thing that man has ever done. It's a quote from one of his songs. Fatalities of fire, poverty, disease, somehow you accepted, incorporated them in your voice's matter-of-factness, resolved to engage the world with hope. Your songs of brotherhood, fairness, equality still spread their fire from tongue to tongue, a chain of flame no fascist retardant can extinguish. James Wright wrote of his old scoutmaster in Martins Ferry, Ohio, "When I think of Ralph Neal, I feel some kind of ice in me breaking open. Thinking of you, I hear the true heartbeat of America and wake again to this day's news in search of a way back to the unfinished dream of our union. Thank you. Thanks. Poetry readings always have some kind of invisible core or magnetic armature that tries to hold them together into some kind of coherence. You know, whether the listeners know it or not, the poet has to have that. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. When I woke up this morning, I was thinking a lot about heroes. Who the very diverse heroes are of our democracy. So I think several of these poems are hero poems. That one certainly was. Here's another one. Some of these heroes we know of, and some we don't. And this is one that, who knows? I don't know how many people know of this hero. It's called Pastor Bob. Pastor Bob. So skinny, you could almost hear his belt buckle scrape his backbone. He was one of those funny little men you meet in the city. From the look of them, wonder how they stay alive. Retired, a volunteer, he tended the chapel in the nursing home where my mother-in-law lived her last years. Whenever we met him in the hallway, his emaciated, thin-bearded face cracked in half with a smile. Definitely an odd duck, I'd think, but nice. He'd exclaim with genuine conviction, "God loves you," or "It's a blessed day." Though darting and mercurial, he never faltered in his kindness, cordiality, morale. Pastor Bob died the night after my mother-in-law passed away. The receptionist told us, bad lungs. He knew he wasn't going to get better. Pastor Bob, a white man, had a congregation in Watts. Pastor Bob marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Pastor Bob died alone by choice in a room with only a bed and a poster of Bobby Kennedy. Why do we learn these things about others so late? Pastor Bob, one of those funny little men you meet in the city, definitely an odd duck, maybe a crazed saint. Thanks. Thank you. Nice thing about poems is a poetry reading doesn't have to follow a kind of a straight, continuous line of argument or reasoning or logic. Poems all come out of individual moments, and part of the poetry is in the silence and the time in between the words. So it's nice just to give a second for the words to sink in. See if I can find this poem. Here's another hero. I'm glad Sue Ann mentioned Gaza. This is for the American hero Rachel Corrie. It's called Courage. And you may remember how her story got buried by the tidal wave of the Gulf War coming in and the bombing a couple of days later, I think it was. Courage, this is called Courage. As the American-made bulldozer lurched toward you, you knelt, submitted with perfect courage to the clear purpose in which you lived. Hardly more yet than a girl, your heart shielded you. You were 23. Kneeling, you stood the test to destruction, became the rare hero in a world deranged by militant armed fear. A regrettable accident, it's in quotes. The pharmacist's house fell. You couldn't save it any more than you could save yourself. You were bulldozed a second time by the war headlines, a shell battered in the surf before the wave of empire. Barely a woman, yet stronger than hate, than death, than earth. And the rest of us, what have we done with our courage? All right. And this is for one of our homegrown heroes. If I can find him. I live in River Falls, Wisconsin, but I spend several days in the Twin Cities each week, usually. And when Paul Wellstone died, I was so moved by the spontaneous shrines to him that were appearing everywhere on the lawns of the Free People's Republic of South Minneapolis, especially. So I wrote this poem, Yard Signs, for Paul and Sheila Wellstone. The yard signs with their black ribbons look bereaved, each a green requiem for a future that has ended before its time. They make this whole city a spontaneous shrine to the dream that rode with your small plane down the week before the elections. I felt safer knowing you were alive. Well, it was refreshing, stone, solid. Your name evoked replenishment and strength. Exclamatory with excitement, your compact fighter's body fired into energy and speech. Wellstone, one of our code words for hope. You walk the road with us and for us. The black ribbon sign says your passion lives on past the shadows of October. They are not hope's graves, but its reminders. Some darkness wrestled you to earth near Eveleth, but your vision will rise again from these yards. Thank you. First couple times I read that poem, I said, Evileth, and someone said, no, you don't mean that. And I said, yes, I do. Okay, I've got a few minutes left here, and I'm going to read you a Wisconsin poem, another Wisconsin poem. Please indulge me, Minnesotans. Across the border, we just cry to be in your place every morning. This is called Real Middle Class, and this poem was born of huge protests in Madison around the time that we really thought that maybe we could do something a couple of years ago. Around that time, Scott Walker said this at a captive audience visit to some little plant in Wausau, Wisconsin. This is what Scott Walker said. We're actually talking to real people at real companies who are the real middle class. Not the tens of thousands of protesters that have been brought in, not only from around Wisconsin, but from Nevada, Illinois, and New Jersey. Increasingly coming in from other states. big union bosses from Washington sending in thugs, unquote. He didn't say anything about the big money that was coming in from out of state for him. So this is called real middle class. This is called, I'll get to them. Real middle class. So who were these people I met in Madison the day we took the square, over 100,000 strong, stood in snow and icy wind slashing as budget cuts for the poor? The nurse from Eau Claire, the first grade teacher from Appleton, the firefighter from Waukesha, the owner of the sign shop in Milwaukee, there with AARP for his first demonstration ever. The cop who came back to join the protesters after his shift guarding the Capitol. The corrections officer holding a sign that read, "If you have to call out the National Guard, you've done something wrong." The organic farmer handing out hot yams wrapped in foil. Unreal middle class? Students, college and high school, more pseudo middle class, apparently. I wonder what real means to you, Governor Walker. You thought that blogger was the real David Koch. How is your grasp of reality? Could it be a few dozen captive audience workers in Wausau or Hudson are more real to you than we are? Speaking of real, you'd have planted phony protester provocateurs to turn the demonstrations ugly if you could. But the police and firefighters, really real, knew what might happen and did their best to make sure it didn't. That warmed this old 60s protester's heart. Among us thugs crowded together in the freezing March chill of Madison, a kindness prevailed, triumphed, a decency in which you had no part. I told him, huh? Thank you. I think I got time for a couple more here. I've got another poem by somebody else, and this is a little poem by a contemporary Irish poet after Seamus Heaney. Some people think that maybe he's the greatest now living Irish poet. Seamus Heaney, no longer living. I was thinking about Jeff's presentation this morning and things that got me thinking about, and maybe you can connect this. It's called "All of These People." Has one really important good idea in it. "All of These People" by Michael Longley. Who was it who suggested that the opposite of war is not so much peace as civilization? He knew our assassinated Catholic greengrocer who died at Christmas in the arms of our Methodist minister, and our ice cream man whose continuing requiem is the 21 flavors children have by heart. Our cobbler mends shoes for everybody. Our butcher blends into his best sausages leeks, garlic, honey. Our corner shop sells everything from bread to kindling. Who can bring peace to people who are not civilized? All of these people, alive or dead, are civilized. Thank you. All right, one more. Thank you. Thank you, Veterans for Peace, for inviting me. It's a real joy and privilege to be here. What? Wrong book. Hey, here we go. I'm going to close with a poem about maybe what's really in crisis in our society right now on many levels. It's called Trust, and this is probably my greatest hit as a poem. It's been blogged to fairly well, and you can find it very easily on the internet if you don't want to buy the book.
Do you have any books to say?
I do.
Good.
I'll be right back there. I'm totally willing to induce a case of writer's cramp on your behalf. So thanks again, and this will be my last word here. Trust. It's like so many other things in life, to which you must say no or yes. So you take your car to the new mechanic. Sometimes the best thing to do is trust. The package left with the disreputable-looking clerk, the check gulped by the night deposit, the envelope passed by dozens of strangers, all show up at their intended destinations. The theft that could have happened doesn't. Wind finally gets where it's going, through the snowy trees, and the river, even when frozen, arrives at the right place. And sometimes you sense how faithfully your life is delivered, even though you can't read the address. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.